Okay, let's start with a sound check. Okay, up there? Can you hear me? Can you hear me up there? Excellent. I want to start with some clarifications. I think there are a couple of places where I may have left things not as clear as I would like them to be. There was one of the slides on which I said something about that ought to be a one-way arrow. Was that slide 932? Can you check your notes, please? 932? I mean, well, 1032. 1032. I'm sorry, 1032. Why is this not opening? Okay. It would be better if we had this. Well, here, I can get to it quickly. That's true and it's not true, all right? And let's look at why it's important to sort out the ways in which it's true and the ways in which it's not true. That was 32, is that correct? Okay. Now, what I was pointing out is the very large negative delta G. And if you have a reaction tube in which that is the only thing undergoing a reaction, that is essentially a one-way reaction. But the cell is not like that. The cell is not like that. The cell has all the other enzymes around it. And so in effect, or in the context of the cell, it is reversible. And there's something that actually kind of highlights that for you. If you look at slide 1039, I'm sorry. You notice here that they're doing the drops. These are the big double drops. So there's hexokinase, there's phosphofructokinase, there's pyruvate kinase. This is the area we were just talking about. And they're showing the two reactions together as having a small drop. And that's because they're coupled reactions, that the products of one are the substrates for the next one or vice versa. And it's an analogy that can help you think about this is that if I were here at the bottom of a hill and the hill's up to there, the ball won't roll uphill by itself. But if there's a hill over here where you drop the ball, it will. Okay? So that arrow, it would be a one-way arrow in isolation. It's good to have it as a two-way arrow in the context of an intact cell. Is that a little better than it was? Are people clear about that? Okay. And the other thing I got confused by because I was so upset with Bill Gates. If you look at slide, I don't know, it just keeps throwing things at me. I know it's not personal. Take a look at slide 1048. And this time you can see it the way around. At least your stuff was the right way around to begin with. I had to take it out of Equation Writer, screen capture it with Grab, turn the TIFF into a JPEG and paste that back in. But now it's right side up. He makes life easy for all of us, doesn't he? What the point of this equation was the sort of the net inputs, the net outputs, focusing especially on glucose and energy. So if you put in glucose, 2 ADP, and 2 inorganic phosphate, you can get out of it 2 lactate and 2 ATP. So it's trying to sort of focus your attention on the key aspects of glycolysis. What's the key outcome of glycolysis? Okay? So I hope that's a little clearer than my babbling was when I was shocked by Bill Gates. Any other questions on the material we talked about up to the end of Monday's lecture? And can someone give me the slide number that we finished on last time? Sorry, what? 50? Thank you. Yes? It's 2. That's correct. It's correct the way it was on the handout for the purpose that we were talking about. All right? So the purpose of that slide is to show you the overall, the net, so to speak. So if you're putting in 1 glucose and 2 inorganic phosphates and 2 ADPs, glycolysis will machinerize it, and out the other end will come 2 lactate and 2 ATP. Okay? I know, and I'm correcting myself because I was so shocked I was not paying attention to what the point of the equation was. Where are we? Is this slide? Why don't I see it? This is still 40. We were slide 50, did you say? Sorry, what? 56? All right. That's right. We decided to skip over the enzyme mechanisms there. We did alcohol and why it's a good idea not to overdo it. And we started gluconeogenesis, right. Okay. So we had started to talk about this second major pathway of carbohydrate metabolism. It's called into use when, for some reason, you have to make sugar instead of burning it. So it's going to be called on when you're under starvation conditions. It's going to be called on when your diet has an excess of fat and protein over carbohydrate. It's not something that's going to be used on a regular basis while we're sitting here. Most of you have eaten recently enough that you're not doing gluconeogenesis. But when you wake up in the morning, your liver is starting to turn this on because it's been 12 hours since you had anything to eat. Because there are 3 irreversible steps to the pathway, Because there are 3 irreversible steps to the pathway, there have to be 3 places where we bypass the reaction. And the first of those is the pyruvate kinase, which goes forward with 1 enzyme, but takes 2 enzymes to go back uphill. And it costs us 2 high-energy bonds, an ATP and a GTP. And we play around with a CO2, we tuck it on, and then we throw it away as part of the way we can help drive the reaction forward. But these steps are, in fact, reversible and in the context of the cell. And there's no real particular difficulty there. And again, as we were talking about reversibility, this is, a kinetically perfect enzyme. Phosphofructokinase. Phosphofructokinase, we invested in ATP, a large free energy drop, major control point. We cannot run uphill by using phosphofructokinase. And so in gluconeogenesis, we have a second bypass step, fructose bisphosphatase. So it takes fructose bisphosphate and takes off 1 phosphate. It might sound like it takes off 2, it's just taking 1 off. So fructose bisphosphatase just throws away that inorganic phosphate. We lose the energy that it took to get it there. Isomerase can flip it around into glucose 6-phosphate, and a second phosphatase, glucose 6-phosphatase, throws away that inorganic phosphate, and now we've made glucose. So that's the third bypass step, bypassing hexokinase, the other enzyme with a large free energy drop. So you knew, having learned glycolysis, you only need to learn 3 steps or 4 reactions to learn gluconeogenesis. Any questions about that before we move on to the regulation and so on? Okay. This is just refreshing this, that the second half of chapter 6 through the end of chapter 10, through the end of today, there are some things in 9 and 10 in the overview of metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism that will overlap or reinforce the things in the citric acid cycle. Those are still potentially going to be on the test. So coming to the next 2 lectures will be helpful to you. Now, gluconeogenesis costs you energy. So you don't want to do it unless you need to do it, because you end up spending 4 high energy bonds more than you can get out of burning a glucose. So this is not a way to get energy. This is a way to get glucose to give to the brain or glucose to give to the kidneys. So it's important to be able to have either glycolysis running or gluconeogenesis running, but you don't want them both running full tilt at the same time, or what you'd have happening would be this. You'd have phosphofructokinase making fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and then you'd have the fructose bisphosphatase taking it off and going back to fructose. And so you'd just be going around and around and around. That's what we call a futile cycle, when you have sort of going around and around with the same substrates multiple times without a real function being served to it. And so, since the phosphofructokinase is the regulated step in glycolysis, and since this is the complementary reaction to it, it's a good place to regulate gluconeogenesis as well. And the reason for that has to do with dynamics. So if you look at a situation, some metabolic situation where A and B are related, where you can go forward to B or you can go back from B to A. If under one set of circumstances you have 10 units going 100 units going forward to B for every 90 that come back, there's only a difference of 10. There's a net flux of 10. But because these are sort of opposed to each other as enzymes, if you increase the activity of the first one just 20%, and you decrease the activity of this one about 20%, you've changed the flux almost 5-fold. So having complementary regulation is a way to have sensitive control over metabolism. There is some cycling in this cell. I mean, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not glucose, glycolysis is on, gluconeogenesis is off. There is some cycling that's going on. But you don't want an inordinate amount of it. You want a regulated or controlled amount of it. And there are also circumstances in which this kind of a cycle is not, in fact, futile. It does serve a purpose, and the purpose, for instance, can be to provide heat. One of the reasons that bumblebees can go out and pollinate things earlier than the honeybees can is because bumblebees sit there and they shiver and they turn on futile cycles and they warm themselves up with metabolically wasteful reactions that are useful in the context of making them warm enough to fly. So we've looked at how you can break sugar down to get energy out of it or to get intermediates out of it. We've looked at how you can build sugar out of other things when you need to do that. Suppose you have more sugar than you know what to do with. How do you store it? And that takes glycogen synthesis. We talked at the beginning about how glycogen is broken down by phosphorylasis, where you can break a bond by adding a phosphate across it. But that process is a one-way trip. It is far from equilibrium. You're not going to get it to go backwards, so that won't let us build glycogen up fresh. So we have an enzyme called phosphoglucomutase. It's a mutase, so it's going to just move some stuff around, and it makes glucose 6-phosphate into glucose 1-phosphate. But now we're going to use UTP, a triphosphate, nucleotide triphosphate. So this is a high-energy intermediate. And what we're going to do with that is we've got this glucose 1-phosphate here, and we're going to connect it to the UTP right there on its first phosphate too. And what that does is it releases a pyrophosphate. Pyrophosphate is an organic phosphate head to tail with another one, okay? When this is released by the pyrophosphorylase, you end up with another enzyme that splits it into 2 inorganic phosphates. This is a very strongly favored reaction. And so by throwing away the high energy bond in there, that provides the driving force to make the glucose 1-phosphate into this monster, UDP glucose. So it's uridine diphosphate with the glucose hanging off of it. That phosphate was on the glucose 1-phosphate, that phosphate was on the UTP. And this is what we call an activated sugar. And we're going to see this strategy of sticking a nucleotide hanging off of a sugar for a number of different contexts. It seems to be a strategy that the cells like quite a lot. In the specific case of glycogen synthase uses UDP glucose as its donor to add a glucose to the polymer. And so UDP glucose is the substrate with glycogen for glycogen synthase. At the end of the reaction, there's a glucose added at the end of the chain, and you get back UDP. So it really only costs you 1 high energy bond to do this, if you do the math on both sides. There's another enzyme that can make branches. It can pick up a bit of this and stick it on there to make a more or less branched form of glycogen. That reaction is energetically reversible. There's lots of it. Something else you might guess is that this is not something that happens all the time. It's very much under hormonal control. And what hormonal control does is it allows the liver especially to be taking into account the metabolic status of the whole organism to sort of, add up the deficits and the extras and so forth so that it knows whether this is a good time to be saving or a good time to be spending. And it cost us just one phosphoanhydride bond to get it on. Some of the other sugars that need to be done are also fairly straightforward. Lactose, is another hexose, and it's a disaccharide that's going to need to have a galactose added onto a glucose. And interestingly, we can turn glucose into galactose for free. That this epimerase goes through a step where NADH is reduced, but then it oxidizes it again. So it's a free reaction, and you can turn glucose into galactose at whatever rate you need. There are some other sugars that are used for various purposes. We talked about O-linked oligosaccharides and N-linked oligosaccharides. We talked about them back in the membrane chapter when we were talking about how the surface of the membrane has glycoproteins and glycolipids out there. And those oligosaccharides are made from other kinds of activated sugars, UDP, CNP principally for the O-linked, UDP, GMP principally for the N-linked. And these are just some examples of the kinds of things that get used. Here's an acetyl-galactosamine. So there's a galactose plus an amine and the acetyl group there. Here's a sialic acid molecule. So there's just plain old mannose. Mannose gets added to some of these sugars as well. Now we're going to talk about, I think, the last major carbohydrate pathway that we're going to talk about, which is the pentose phosphate pathway. And the pentose phosphate pathway is also very old, perhaps older than the top half of glycolysis. And it does a lot of different stuff. One of its important functions is to make NADPH. And NADPH is the form that's often used for synthesis, biosynthesis. And in contrast to the NADH, which we were making in glycolysis, that could be used for energy. The other thing that pentose phosphate pathway is used for is to make ribose, the 5-carbon sugar that we need in nucleic acids. The common first step to all of those things is the reaction of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. So here is the starting material for the pentose phosphate pathway. It's a hexose, just to make life confusing. But glucose 6-phosphate was also, the second intermediate in glycolysis, right? It's a product of hexokinase. So that's one of the reasons hexokinase is not the principal regulator for glycolysis. Its product, glucose 6-phosphate, can be used for glycolysis. It can also be used for the pentose phosphate pathway. So it's not the prime place to regulate that pathway. And what happens is we have a carbon here, which you can see here has an alcohol. At the end of this happening is now a carbonyl oxygen. So that carbon was oxidized. And the electrons that happened in that oxidation reduction reaction are now over here on NADPH. So this NADPH is in the reduced state that's useful for biosynthesis. This is a lactone, as it happens. In the next step, we're going to open up that ring with a phosphogluconolactonase. Don't bother to remember that enzyme name. Where we just use a water to add across there. But the interesting thing is now we have an acid sugar. So this is 6-phosphogluconate. It's an acid at that end. And you may have heard of gluconate in the context of things like taking up various kinds of minerals and so on. Some of the vitamin companies use it for that. So this is a one-directional but free reaction. And then the third step in the pentose phosphate pathway, again, produces an NADPH for us. But this time it's driven through release of a carbon dioxide. So if we're starting over here looking at this molecule, you can see that this carbon here So we go 1, 2, here's the phosphate end to count from 1, 2, 3, 4. If we look over here, 1, 2, 3, 4. What was an alcohol over here is a carbonyl oxygen over there. And what happened is the electrons from up there ended into the NADPH. The carbon dioxide came off, and now we have ribulose 5-phosphate. So we've gone from a 6-carbon sugar to a 5-carbon sugar. This decarboxylation, again, often helps to drive oxidation reduction reactions. Ribulose is very convertible into ribose. Got its name because it's so similar to ribose. So here's the isomerase that'll flip them around, and ribulose, sorry, was there a question? Sorry. Ribulose has its carbonyl oxygen here. Ribose has it on the very end. As you can imagine, those are not terrifically different states. So now we have ribose 5-phosphate. It's already sounding interesting. So far, we've already gotten 2 NADPH and a ribose. This is promising. This is a pathway that might be worth keeping in mind. So if you were going to make deoxyribonucleic acids, you have to at some point reduce that alcohol down to a H. So making the deoxynucleotides requires NADPH as a reducing power to reduce that down to the hydrogen. So that's kind of handy. We're making reducing power at the same time we're making some ribose. So they're kind of walking hand in hand at the moment. Now things get a little more complicated. And I am not going to ask you to look in detail at all of the interactions that go on in the rest of the pentose phosphate pathway. What I do want you to understand is the strategy that recurs in here, that there is a strategy within the pentose phosphate pathway that we're going to see again in the dark reactions of photosynthesis. And that strategy is sort of twofold. There are isomerases and epimerases that can change one 5-carbon sugar into another one, or one 3-carbon sugar into another one. So the isomerases and epimerases work with the same chain length, but rearrange it within that chain. And then 2 other cute enzymes called transketolase and transaldolase can actually lengthen or shorten them. You remember that an aldolase is named for an aldol condensation, that it's named in the direction of sticking the 2 3-carbons together. So that's an aldol condensation. Transaldolase can do that kind of a thing to a number of different compounds shifting around 2 or 3-carbon pieces. Transketolase does a somewhat similar reaction, which has some differences, but same general principle here. And so what good does that do us? Well, let's take a little look at some of these reactions. By the way, all of these reactions, all 4 of those reactions, are free. They don't cost anything. If we start off with 3 5-carbon sugars, remember we finished up with ribose at the end of as far as we got. So if we start off with 3 5-carbon sugars, you can pluck 2 carbons off the end of this one and stick it onto that one. And now we have a 3-carbon and a 7-carbon sugar. In a different reaction, you can take 3 off the top of that one and stick it back. Now we've got a 6-carbon and a 4-carbon sugar. You can take 2 from the 5-carbon, put it on the 4, and now we have 2 6-carbon sugars and 1 3-carbon sugar. And so it allows you to rearrange the carbon backbones to things anywhere from 3 to 7. The 7-carbon backbone is pretty much only an intermediate to other things, but you've seen examples of all the rest of those already. So looking at this as an overview, this is a way to sort of see the general reactions of it all in one place. We've talked about how glucose 6-phosphate can be oxidized into ribulose 5-phosphate. That's going to yield us 2 NADPH, and it released a carbon dioxide. Because this has been oxidized, this part of the pathway is called the oxidative phase. What happens to ribulose 5-phosphate is now fairly manifold. One of, excuse me. Here we go. One of the handy things about sugar metabolism is that they have their phosphates on their tail, so you know how long the sugars are from that. And so ribose 5-phosphate's a 5-carbon sugar, xylulose 5-phosphate's a 5-carbon sugar, and again, more xylulose down there. So with these two 5-carbon sugars, you can make a glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. We've heard of that one before from glycolysis. And that 7-carbon one, heptulose. Heptulose is the giveaway there of 7. Some more rearrangements, and now we can have a fructose 6-phosphate. So up there, we were glucose 6-phosphate, and now we're at fructose 6-phosphate. We just took a really long path to get there, plus a 4-carbon erythrose. But if you play footsie between the erythrose and the xylulose, you can now get another fructose 6-phosphate out and a GAP, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So that was our reason for showing you that specific shuffling, is because it's possible to take the products of the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway and make intermediates for glycolysis. So it connects back into glycolysis sometimes. One of the other names for the pentose phosphate pathway is the pentose phosphate shunt. And you can actually see here the S, because I was using the old name for it. And it's a shunt from the top of glycolysis sort of into the middle of it. So this is sort of again a high-level view at how the outcome of the pentose phosphate pathway depends on the demands in the cell at the time. So one way of using it is to do rearrangements that produce principally ribose 5-phosphate, which might be important, for instance, when you're doing a lot of nucleic acid synthesis. In another mode, you can do your oxidation here and have lots of NADP plus ribose, so you have some of both of them going on. Another way of doing it is to start with your oxidative phase, your 5-carbon sugars, feed them back in and run them up glycolysis. You can actually burn a glucose completely to CO2 by running this around 6 times. So that's a way to produce a lot of reducing power. So you can completely oxidize the glucose running it in that way. A fourth way of using it, you can make some reducing power up here, and then with the other intermediates feeding it down through glycolysis, end up with pyruvate, ATP, and some fuel for something else. So a real variety of how this pathway can be used in cells. So mode 1 is one where you do it when you need a lot more ribose than you do NADPH. And this is giving you a sort of a sketch of how that would go. You have to get down to the 3-carbon sugars, and then you can go back up to the 5-carbon. In mode 2, you need about the same amount of both of them. In that case, you can start from glucose 6-phosphate and have a fairly direct route to the ribose. And using it in that way, you're going to get 2 NADPH for every ribose that you make from a glucose. In the third mode, you want to use this really just to make reducing power. And this is the one where I said you can end up completely burning a glucose to carbon dioxide. That you begin in the oxidative phase, you've got your 5-carbon sugars, you feed them back in, and they go up the hill through basically gluconeogenesis to make a glucose phosphate. And in the fourth one, you can make both reducing power and a fair amount of energy to be used during biosynthesis or something else. So this is a pathway. It almost isn't a pathway, it's like a maze. There are a number of different reactions, and the exact balance of how much goes through which way will be shaped by what the cell is doing. I'm not going to tell you which enzyme is regulated in the pentose phosphate pathway, because there's no regulated enzyme. This is one of the very few pathways where the demand on the pathway is what determines the flux on the pathway. I mean, it would be kind of hard to find a committed step on something that's a network, you know? So. And it's not just sort of a side light that's a little weird. This is a crucial pathway in some synthetically active tissues. And so if you look at tissues that are involved in one or another kind of lipid synthesis, so here's some organs that are involved in the steroid synthesis, like the adrenal gland and the testes and the ovary, or they're involved in fatty acid synthesis, like the liver, the adipose tissue, the mammary gland. And so you can imagine when you're making steroids or fatty acids, you need a lot of reducing power because those lipids are highly reduced. So the NADPH is very useful for that. But another one that has a highly active pentose phosphate pathway, interestingly, is red blood cells. And they use it because they need large quantities of what's called glutathione, and we'll see what that is in a second. It's kind of a regulator of reducing power. Here's a picture of the reduced form of glutathione. It's a tripeptide, glutamate, cysteine, glycine. And in this tripeptide, the cysteine sulfhydryl is ideally situated to be reversibly oxidized and reduced. So in this case, it's in the reduced form. And the oxidized glutathione is two of them side by side as an SS bridge. And it's a molecule that the cell uses to deal with oxidative stress. And so glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase is important in fighting oxidative stress because it provides the NADPH that the red blood cells need. If you don't have very much glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, you can't make very much reduced glutathione. And in that situation, your red blood cells will have a lower threshold for stress. And if you live in malarial areas, that's a good thing. This particular enzyme deficiency or enzyme alteration is much more common than you would think, something that has on the face of it a harmful side effect. But multiple different forms of that mutation have come up in several places in the world where malaria is common, so around the Mediterranean and some places in Southeast Asia, because it makes it hard for malarial parasites to grow in your red blood cells. So if you're heterozygous for this, it's protective. Very different chemical strategy from sickle cell hemoglobin, but the same outcome of trying to protect the heterozygotes from a common and very damaging disease. Somehow I lost my pointer. Okay. So this is an overview of glucose metabolism. This is trying to look at all of it on one page to try to give you a chance to hold in mind all the pieces at once. Where should we start? Let's look at glucose. So glucose with ATP can give us glucose 6-phosphate, and that can then go into the glycolytic pathway, down to the 3-carbon sugars, which themselves can go on down through here to pyruvate or lactate. You can also have the reverse pathway of gluconeogenesis coming up that way and producing glucose that then can be released off for the brain or whatever. If we want to talk about glucose that's not coming from the bloodstream, maybe it's coming from a glycogen supply. If we have glycogen and we need glucose, phosphorylasis can give us that glucose 1-phosphate, which is energetically equivalent and gets isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate. If we've got an abundance of glucose and it's time to store it, we use glycogen synthase and the UTP to activate that glucose. And the side arm out here is showing you the pentose phosphate pathway that's sort of connected to, as a loop almost, to glycolysis, producing the 2 NADPHs, potentially ending in ribose or potentially feeding back in at different levels in glycolysis. So it's not an insurmountable amount of stuff to hold in mind, that they do connect. I thought I'd take a little time here at the end. Oh, wait a second, before we do that, let's do the cards. Angie, you want to talk and I'll spread cards? You do some cards and also do some cards. What I'd like you to do, on one side of it, if you'd like me to know that you were here today, write your name. Up to you. On the other side, I encourage you to think about a study question or a test question on either the overview of metabolism or membranes or, sorry, not membranes, membranes. Is membranes in this group or not? I'm flustered. Yes, membranes or overview of metabolism or carbohydrate metabolism. So, okay.
Can you guys hear me? You guys hear me? Okay, tonight we're supposed to have study group at 7 o'clock. And if you're planning on coming tonight, can you see me after class? I'm sitting down here in the corner. The only reason I'm asking you to do this tonight is because of our wonderful stellar weather that's making us all excited for spring break and getting the heck out of here. So if you're planning on coming tonight, please come and see me and we can hammer out if we're going to go ahead with the group tonight or just cancel for this week. So I'd appreciate it if you'd stop and see me. Thanks. And if you aren't sure yet and we do decide to cancel, I'll send out an email to everybody. So check your email if you're not sure. Thanks.
I'll pass this down. Oh, well, you're welcome to come. I hope you all knew already that there are study questions from the previous round when we did this already on the web, that's on Icon already. Thank you. Susan? Want a little more time? It looks like you're still writing. Who knows? Maybe one of your questions will end up on the test. You good? You know, it's quite possible to ask questions you don't know the answer to. Video don't mind. It's quite possible to ask questions you don't know the answer to. Pete Rubenstein in our department loves metabolism. He absolutely loves metabolism. It fascinates him. And he had a PhD student whose subject involved some arabinose on something. And so he asked him in his thesis defense, so can you tell me about the synthetic pathway that makes arabinose? And the poor student just about dies. And they go on with the exam, and afterwards the student asks Pete, so how do they make arabinose? Oh, I don't know, I just wanted to find out. So I try not to ask you questions that I don't already know. Feel free to go on writing if you want to. At the end, please put your cards in the box. But let's talk a little bit about the last things we have in your handout there. These are some things that are not in your textbook, I believe, but they're aspects of carbohydrate metabolism that have gotten a lot of currency lately. And so they're worth spending a little bit of time on. People who have actual diabetes have to worry about blood glucose quite a bit. But for all of us, there's a growing sort of rumble that maybe we need to think about dietary composition and so forth a bit. And one of the strategies for trying to avoid glucose that people have come up with is to use sugar alcohols. And so these are some examples of sugar alcohols where they have no carbonyl oxygen. Everyone has an alcohol off of it instead of one of them being an aldehyde. And so these can't cyclize, for instance. They can't make circular forms. But they're also metabolized much more slowly, or not at all in some cases, than 5 or 6 carbon sugars would be. These are sugar alcohols. Xylitol was isolated from a tree, and xylose is Greek for tree. I don't remember the sources of the others. And there have been a number of approaches taken to how to deal with carbohydrates in the diet and what might be useful or interesting to do. And there have been, since the 60s, I think, low carbohydrate diets of one kind or another in which the rationale is to limit access to carbohydrates to the point where you start having ketosis, and that also would involve a low insulin state in the bloodstream. And this used to be called the drinking man's diet in the 60s. It's the Atkins diet now, much more polite name for it. And it got a lot of bad press. You must be wrecking your kidneys, you must be this and that. In point of fact, I have not found reliable reviewed papers that can show that a low carbohydrate diet actually hurts you. It's one of these cases where people thought, well, it ought to, but they didn't actually go out and look. The other thing about it that's quite interesting is there are some people with seizures, with epileptic seizures, for whom nothing else will control their seizures. And so for some people who have tried every anti-seizure medicine that's available, a low-carbohydrate diet like this, for some reason, will control them, possibly because the brain is working off of ketone bodies more than off of sugar. It's tough. I mean, the low-carbohydrate diets, to get in the range where they're supposed to start working, involve very significant restrictions on a whole lot of different foods. And so another approach that has been proposed over the last few decades is something called the low glycemic index. And a glycemic index is asking for 100 grams of carbohydrate in the food, how much of a bump in the blood sugar is going to happen? How much does it make your blood sugar rise? And so if you have a low glycemic index, it doesn't make your blood sugar rise much. If it has a high glycemic index, it makes the big hill and the overshoot. And some kinds of things that have a low glycemic index are the kinds of things that wouldn't surprise you a whole lot. Whole grains, because they have fiber and the particle size is bigger and so on. Fruits tend to have a low glycemic index because they're mostly water. And vegetables, which again have what they have in forms that take some digesting to get at it. And this last line is just pointing out that all of this stuff is relative to whatever else you're doing. If you're exercising one way or another for an hour or two a day, you can basically eat whatever you like. You're not going to have any problem with your blood sugar. I just can't run that much every day. Now, what on earth happened here? Oh. You know what? This looked okay on my computer, and my secretary didn't notice it looked kind of weird to her. I will try to post a Word document with this in it, which will show you the rest of the things. There's obviously more than orange juice and apple juice to eat on low glycemic things. But this does give you a list of some high glycemic index foods. If pure glucose is a standard of 100, so it's not too surprising that potatoes and cornflakes are fairly high. Cheerios is a bit better. It's a whole grain cereal. Graham crackers are a whole grain cereal, so they're a bit better. Honey is basically sugar, but it's not quite so bad as glucose. Watermelon is very high. I love watermelon. Table sugar is not quite so high because table sugars have fructose. And raisins, again, have a significant amount of fructose. So this is glycemic index, and I'll post one that shows you some moderately and low glycemic index things there. But what's probably more interesting here is this chart that did work, which is taking into account the idea that it's not just comparing 100 grams of glucose in this food to 100 grams of carbohydrate in this food, because some of these foods, you don't eat enough of them to get 100 grams of sugar. So like for watermelon, for instance, watermelon has so much water in it that by the time you've eaten 100 grams of sugar in it, you've eaten more watermelon than anybody would eat. And so what glycemic load does is it combines the glycemic index, the inherent tendency of that food to raise your blood sugar, with a typical serving size. And so if a typical serving size has only 20 grams of carbohydrate, you correct the glycemic index for that by taking that into account. And the rule of thumb here is that below 10 should be considered a low glycemic load. And you can see some things in here that have very low glycemic loads. So peanuts, for instance, glycemic load of 2. Well, peanuts are mostly protein and fat, so that's not too surprising. Grapefruit had a glycemic index of 25, but a load of only 3 because there's a lot of water in grapefruit. Spaghetti, medium. Something between 10 and 20 would be considered a moderate glycemic load. Pizza actually is in there with the moderate glycemic load, because there's a lot of stuff in pizza besides the starch. Bananas are moderate glycemic loads, so their sugar content and their availability is substantially higher than things like oranges or apples or grapefruits. Above 20, we're talking about a large glycemic load. And so potato chips, sorry about that. It's 4 ounces, easy to eat, and it's all starch. Snickers bar, brown rice. And the nice news is, though I don't have it on this table, watermelon ends up with a glycemic load of around 8 or something. So glycemic load is another way of thinking about food. It shouldn't create a feeling that you have to weigh and measure everything that you eat first. It's more like knowing how your car works, so you remember to put oil in it every 3,000 miles. And the rule of thumb that somebody once said to sort of forget all of this stuff so you can do it easily is eat colorful food. Most of the sort of regular type foods that have a high glycemic load are white. So mashed potatoes, white rice, white bread. But if you're eating whole grains and tomatoes and berries and asparagus and broccoli, colorful foods, they'll almost all have a good glycemic load. Some of you may have heard things about this molecule as it being a terrible molecule. This is Splenda, or sucralose, and it's sucrose with a chlorine atom there and a chlorine atom there. Those 2 chlorines make it unable to be metabolized, and for some reason make it sweeter than ordinary sucrose, which we don't quite understand. Maybe it sits on the receptor for longer. We don't know. People have asked me if it's safe, and I've told them that I had Splenda when I was pregnant with my kids, and my kids drink Splenda all the time, and one of them went to Olin and is now working for Google. The other one just got into the honors program here, so it can't be too bad for you. Oh, the graph is gone. The graph is in the handout, but not on the screen. Now, how did that one happen? Look it. I will recommend to you to think your way through the red blood cell slide, and I'll see if I can get it in. Oh, that's right. Oh. At any rate, it's 4:20, so I'll see y'all Friday. Don't forget to hand in your cards. Remember to hand in your cards as you go by.